My name's Rebecca Snyder, and I'm the Executive Director of MDDC. I did want to note that we're recording this session. So when we talk about recording the session, when you have questions, which we really do welcome, we'll do that more at the end of the presentation. Keep it general. If you need something specific, you can always go through MDDC's legal hotline, which Ballard Spahr is our fabulous pro bono attorney and always available for those kind of transactional questions. So we're here today to kick off our new webinar series, the Need to Know series, and we're focusing on elections and copyright. You know, obviously that's riding through reporting just in general and what we're doing. So Leah has a couple slides about elections, but she will be generally talking about news gathering. And as I've mentioned, we have Aaliyah Smith from Ballard Spahr. Her practice is defending publishers against defamation suits and other news gathering torts. She's been an associate with Ballard Spahr for the past couple years, right? You've been around?
Yeah, I was at Levine Sullivan, which is a boutique media law firm, and we merged with Ballard in 2017.
Okay, so she has a lot of, well, probably sadly a lot of experience in this copyright law situation. And what we're really going to kind of jump into is talking about what you can and what you can't use. We have members who kind of routinely get saddled by those digital pirates saying you used a photo that you shouldn't have used. So Aaliyah is really going to help us make sure that everybody stays on the straight and narrow and can focus on reporting and information gathering rather than getting tangled up in lawsuits. I mentioned we're recording. I also want to mention, as part of our housekeeping, if you're not speaking, please stay muted. I'll be monitoring the chat for questions or concerns. And with that, I will turn it over to Aaliyah, who will share her screen, and we'll get started.
Thank you, Rebecca. I'm happy to be here. Let me just share the screen. All right, so as Rebecca mentioned, I'm going to be talking about some of the basics of copyright law, just to go over the foundation of the law and so that you know how it works and what's generally permitted and what's not permitted. And we'll go over some typical examples and as well as examples that have come up in lawsuits to hopefully give us a sense of the kinds of things that are acceptable uses and those that are not. So without further ado, in a nutshell, copyright law protects written words, videos, photos, art, anything that is in tangible form, unless it's in the public domain. And I'll talk about what that means in a minute. It does not protect facts, ideas, or opinions. You do not have to register a copyright in order for it to be valid. As soon as a work is created, a copyright attaches to it. And once you have that copyright, you, if you're the creator of the work, have the exclusive right, as you see, to reproduce, distribute, perform, or display it. So I mentioned the public domain. Works that are in the public domain are not protected by copyright law, and you're free to use them. However, the public domain is pretty limited. It's for works that are very old, generally created before 1925. And also, works created by the federal government are not subject to copyright law. But if something is on the internet, does not mean it's in the public domain. If something is on social media, does not mean it's in the public domain. Basically anything, unless it was created by the federal government, anything created after 1925 or so is going to be subject to copyright law. And so you need to think about whether you can use it. So how can I lawfully use a copyrighted work? There's two basic ways. One is to get a license. That's obviously the safest choice. Two is to use a justification recognized in the law for the use of copyrighted works. And for our purposes, that's called fair use. It's a legal doctrine that allows you in certain circumstances to use someone else's work without getting a license. So we'll talk about both of those things. But before I get into that, Rebecca had mentioned the sort of copyright mills that go around and sue you for copyright infringement or otherwise send you demand letters. And that is one of the reasons why sort of talking about this is so important right now. So a lot of times these copyright trolls, which is what we tend to call them, use these reverse image search tools to scour the internet or other places looking for any possible infringements. And one guy that you guys might have heard of, although he's a little bit more active in New York, is this guy called Richard Leibowitz, who, as you can see from this lawsuit, which was some years ago now, or has filed over 500 cases in this district, in 2 years. Since then he's filed hundreds more. His MO is to find potential copyright infringements and just file lawsuits, and he's filed hundreds and hundreds of them, all over the country. And for the most part, people pay to settle with him because it's a huge pain to litigate a copyright case. And so this is one of those reasons why, we need to be vigilant about making sure uses are valid. All right, so I mentioned the first way to use someone else's work is to get authorization. Now, in the news business, it's not always feasible for you to have a 40-page contract that gives you the rights to use somebody else's work. You might just have to do a quick email or a quick social media text, in order to get permission from somebody. And that's okay. I mean, even if it doesn't have all the bells and whistles of a contract that a lawyer might write, getting something in writing saying that you have permission to use it is generally going to be okay to justify your use. So to give you an example, this guy, David Summers, tweeted this photo that he saw on he had landed on a tarmac in Las Vegas. And as he was sitting on the tarmac, he saw this plane on another part of the tarmac catch fire. And so he took this pretty amazing photo of through the plane window of this plane catching fire. And so then what happened? Everybody asks him, can I have permission for this? Can I have permission for this? Can I have permission for this? And, these don't have a lot of bells and whistles, but if he replies to these and says yes, that should be sufficient. So if you're going to try and use an informal license like this to use someone's photo from social media or that you've otherwise found on the internet, the information here on the screen is something you want to try and get to make your license as complete as possible. So first you want to make sure it's clear what work you're talking about using. If someone has posted a bunch of pictures on his Twitter page, identify which pictures you're interested in, say why you're going to use them. Are you going to use them in print? Are you going to use them on the internet, etc.? And do your best to get a representation that the person who posted the picture is actually the person who owns the copyright. That is the person who took the picture. And so there's a quick little example here on the screen of the kind of thing you can just tweet back at somebody or text them to get permission. Another way to get authorization for using photos is if you get them off of some of these sites that give you permission through their terms of service or terms of use. So like Flickr, Wikimedia Commons, often will have pictures or images made available that have specific licenses written into their terms of service, and then you can use them. What you need to be careful about is making sure that you read the allowable uses carefully, because sometimes the uses allowed are only for personal use or for educational use. So you need to make sure that you're taking it and using it in a way that's permitted by the license on the site. Excuse me one second. And so here's just a note about social media, because we get this question all the time. The images posted on social media generally belong to whoever created those images or took that video. They don't belong to the social media companies. When you post something on a social media site, you are not giving the copyright to that social media company. And so generally speaking, those companies cannot grant you a license to use someone else's photo. All right, so we mentioned that we're going to talk a little bit about campaign issues related to getting authorization for copyright. And you know, when you want to use images or video that you didn't create in covering campaigns, you know, the safest thing to do is going to be to get them from a service that you subscribe to, like Getty or AP, or you can get them from official campaign media person. If a campaign's, you know, media office or communications office gives you materials, then it's generally safe to use them. As for materials from a campaign's website, some might give you permission to use those materials in their terms of use or elsewhere. You know, for example, you can see this Lisa Blunt Rochester one directs you to her Flickr page, and so you can go to her Flickr page and see what the terms are there for use. You know, other ones like Trump and Biden, for example, allow only personal use from their websites, so you should coordinate with their press offices about using images on their website as opposed to just taking things directly from the website. And in general, you need to be wary about taking material from candidates' websites, because often the images that are on there are images that have been licensed by the campaigns from professional photographers. So even if a campaign, for example, wouldn't care if you took a photo, they might be happy to have the coverage. The photographer who took that photo, you know, might have a different frame of mind. And that is exactly what happened in this case from a couple of years ago. So you see on the bottom of your screen, there's a picture of AOC there in the middle that was used by Fox News in discussing something about her. They apparently did not get permission from the photographer to use this photo, and the photographer sued them, and Fox ended up settling. I don't know what the story was with why they thought they could use this photo. You know, maybe somebody gave it to them and, you know, they believed it was an official communications person, or it's unclear. But Richard Leibowitz, the guy who I mentioned to you earlier in the presentation, who's the copyright troll who goes around trolling for images that are unlicensed, took on this case, and Fox settled with them. We don't know for how much, but certainly something you want to try to avoid. And then let me just say one more thing about this photo. You know, you might ask, you know, is this use a fair use? And we will be talking about that in a minute as we get to the fair use part of the presentation. All right, so regarding authorization, I think the main things you want to take away from this are, one, that it's always safer to get permission than to rely on fair use. As I'll talk about in a minute, fair use is a little bit of an amorphous concept. And so while you can believe that something that you're doing is a fair use, it's ultimately going to be up to a court to decide whether the use is fair or not. And so having a writing that says definitely you are allowed to use this photo is always going to be safer than relying on a, you know, somewhat fluid doctrine. You know, as I mentioned, permission does not have to be formal, but you should make sure that you are getting permission from someone who's authorized to give it. So for example, if you look in the bottom left-hand corner of your screen, you'll see an example of this. So what happened in that case is that there was the earthquake in Haiti some years ago that you might remember. And there were not very many Western photographers on the ground there when it happened. And so the media was quite desperate for images from this. And so at some point there was a photographer, a Haitian photographer, who posted pictures of some of the devastation. A different person took those photos and reposted them himself. The media asked that second person for permission to use the photos. He said, sure. And then it came out that he wasn't the owner. He wasn't authorized to give a license. And so a lot of media companies got sued by the actual photographer, who ended up winning over $1 million in court for these uses because they were obviously very valuable as some of the only images coming out of Haiti at the time. The same, sort of by the same token, if you see in this GameSpot Spider-Man shoot here, there was a freelance photographer who happened upon the film shoot for one of the Spider-Mans in New York, and he took a bunch of pictures, posted them on his website. This GameSpot website believed that this was a press website and that the photos were free to take because it was, press photos. But no, he was trying to sell those photos. And so CBS Interactive, again, ended up settling with the photographer, even though it was an innocent infringement, even though it had a good faith belief that it was allowed to use these photos. And so that's what I mean when I say copyright is strict liability. It doesn't matter if you meant it, if you meant to infringe someone's copyright. If you use something without authorization and it's not a fair use, even if you believe you had the right to use it, you're still potentially on the hook. Now your damages are going to be less, but you're not going to be out of hot water. Okay, and Rebecca, if we have any questions now about authorization, I'm happy to take them before we move on to fair use.
Okay, I have carefully muted everyone, so if you have a question, unmute yourself and ask Alia.
I have a question about Creative Commons licenses.
Uh-huh.
One, many of them say not for commercial use.
Right.
How does that apply to news organizations?
Yeah, so generally speaking, that will, I'd like to see what the rest of the verbiage is in some of those Creative Commons licenses. But generally speaking, a news use is not going to be considered a commercial use, because what that's talking about is you can't use this image and put it on t-shirts and sell those t-shirts, or, or to advertise your product in some way. News is generally not treated like a commercial product in the same way that, for example, consumer goods or services are. But I'd like to sort of see the surrounding language, because I can't tell you with 100% certainty that that's necessarily always going to be the case.
Okay, anyone else have questions? All right, let's scamper on to understanding fair use.
Okay. I have one more question.
Yeah, go ahead, Deb.
And then, so you need the permission of the photographer, or
Right.
whoever created it.
Yep.
What about the person who's in the image? So in the case of OC, she's a public figure, but I don't know if that makes a difference. But anyway, you have to, when do you have to obtain their permission too?
Generally, you don't have to obtain the person's permission unless it's showing something very private about them, because then you might get into an issue of privacy concerns. So for example, if somebody, took a photo of their friend, receiving some kind of medical treatment in the hospital, and you want to use it for a story that you're doing about some new medical technology, I would want to get permission from the person in that photo, because she might have a privacy claim against you if you're showing her in sort of a vulnerable state. But otherwise, you generally do not need to get permission of the person in the photo.
Appropriation, which I realize wouldn't apply necessarily to news organizations, right? But
yes,
you would make t-shirts, whatever.
Right. No. So that's, yes, that dovetails exactly with what I was saying about the Creative Commons license. So it's a different story. If you want to buy a photo of a person and you get permission from the copyright owner, and then you want to take that photo and put it on t-shirts or use it in an advertising campaign for something, in that case, you would need to get permission from the person in there, because they could have a right of publicity claim against you potentially, or a misappropriation claim. Generally speaking, those misappropriation claims do not apply to news gatherers. So if you were using that image in the context of a news story, a documentary, that kind of a thing, you're not going to generally need to get permission of the subject of the photo. But if you, for some reason, are going to use it for a commercial purpose, then you would need to get permission. You're right.
Like when the Chicago Sun-Times ran a photograph of the first Bulls championship with Michael Jordan, they were fine on the news pages, but when they used a t-shirt with that image, in a marketing, free t-shirt giveaways for a marketing thing, they ran into hot water.
That's exactly right. And Michael Jordan is an interesting example because he's been quite litigious about, you know, the use of his image, because, and you can sort of understand it in a way because celebrities market their image, and so it's valuable to him to be able to sell it. And so this does come up, and in fact it also came up with Michael Jordan in another case where they did some kind of a special this may be even the same issue that you're talking about, you know, a special championship insert to the paper, and one of the advertisers, I think it was a steakhouse, I want to say, you know, said something like, "Congratulations to Michael Jordan and the Bulls, you know, everybody gets $1 off, something, something, something." And he sued the advertiser in that case for the use of his image, and you know, ended up prevailing. So you do need to be careful in those instances, but for straight news uses, it shouldn't be a problem.
Right. And also, just to add to that, right of publicity sometimes changes state to state, and occasionally Maryland has dealt with legislation around right to publicity, and that could happen, you know, from time to time. So just kind of recognize that local laws may affect that as well.
Yeah, and I mean, yeah, there's definitely, if you're talking about right of publicity, there's a lot of different states. Some states, you know, don't give a right of publicity to dead celebrities, for example, or dead anyone. You know, other states are, like California, are much more protective of celebrity rights. So if you're going to make a commercial use or anything that's arguably a commercial use of something, you should definitely talk to us or another lawyer, you know, before going ahead with that.
Terrific. So why don't we go on to understanding fair use? I'm always, as timekeeper, I always get a little worried. We're at 9:53 and I want to make sure we can fit all this terrific information in.
Okay, yes, let's talk about fair use. All right, so the way that you are using the work that you want to use is what is how you figure out whether it's a fair use. And so the statute, the copyright statute, actually tells us the factors that a court is going to consider when deciding whether the use you make of something is considered fair. And that means, as you see here on the screen, the purpose and character of the use. How are you using it? Are you transforming it? Are you making it something a little bit different than what it was? The court likes that. It's looking at the nature of the copyrighted work. Is it something that is got a lot of creative elements to it, or not? So for example, a cell phone video that someone shoots is not going to have probably that many creative elements to it. On the other hand, if someone takes a cell phone video and then, edits it and adds graphics and, does a bunch of other work to it to make a little product, that finished product is going to have more copyright protection than, a straight cell phone video. The amount and substantiality of the portion used, meaning the smaller the amount of someone's copyrighted work that you use, the more likely it is to be a fair use. And finally, the effect of the use on the potential market, meaning, is this the kind of thing that someone normally licenses for money? And if you are using the kind of thing that someone usually licenses for money, that's going to weigh against fair use. I want to point out that newsworthiness is not necessarily fair use. It might be a factor that gets considered in the mix, but just because something is newsworthy does not automatically make it a fair use. And so a good example of this is those pictures from Haiti that I mentioned before. They were obviously extremely newsworthy. They were some of the only images coming out of this devastating earthquake. But that fact alone did not make their use fair when they were taken by a professional photographer whose livelihood depends on him licensing photos like that. So a use is likely not to be fair if you use the content only to enliven your report. And we'll talk about some examples of these things in a minute. If it is the dominant element of your report, if you're using something that hasn't been published before, if it was created by a professional, if it's used in promotion or advertising as opposed to in a straight news story. And one danger that happens sometimes is that you license a photo for use in one story, you go to your archives in connection with another story, you see this photo and you think, oh, this would be good for this story, and you take it and you may not have a license for a second use. So you need to be careful about that. So just looking at some examples, This photo of AOC that we talked about earlier, now the question of fair use was never litigated because the case settled. But in the answer to the complaint, they asserted a fair use defense. In my view, the fair use defense would have been pretty unlikely to succeed in this case. All they have done is taken this photo in order to illustrate Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez and put a picture of her up there. They're not talking about anything specific about the picture. They are only using it to enliven a report, about this party split. So I think that a fair use defense in that case, would have been very hard to win. I pulled up another election photo from Politico from just the primary recently in Massachusetts. And, in this case, this photo was licensed from Getty or another service, but this is the example of the kind of photo where if you just pull it off the internet without getting a license and put it in your story, it's not likely to be a fair use. This story is not about this photo. It is just being used to enliven a story about the primary results. So that's the kind of thing that if you just pull offline and post in your story, without further information, you're not likely to win a fair use case. So let's talk about ways that a photo or any other kind of image or video is more likely to be a fair use. One is when the story is about the content or existence of the work, or comments on the work in some way. If you're talking about the photo, as opposed to just using the photo as art in your story, that's more likely to be a fair use. Again, if you use only an excerpt, smaller, lower resolution photo, or a photo that you have, marked up in some way, things that have already been published are more likely to be a fair use. And if the photo was not taken by a professional photographer, this is both because of the marketability question, but also just because as a practical matter, a layperson is probably less likely to sue you than a professional photographer whose livelihood depends on licensing his or her photographs. All right, so let's look at another example. So this is the photograph that we looked at earlier with this plane on the tarmac. Now, I think that if you were to use this photo in a story about this plane catching fire on the tarmac without sort of discussing the photo at all, but just say, look at this amazing, or sorry, take that back. A straight news story about this plane catching fire on the tarmac, I think that would unlikely be a fair use. However, if you want to do a story like Tech Dirt did here about this photograph and how it caused all of these journalists to email this guy who took and posted the photo, or to reply on social media and ask about it, then I think you're much more likely to have a fair use. This whole story is about the photo and the media scrum that it inspired. Same thing here. So this wasn't an actual lawsuit, but I think it's an interesting example. So you may remember, I guess a couple of years ago now, with Ralph Northam in Virginia with his blackface scandal. If you were just doing, let's say, a profile of Ralph Northam and you wanted to use this photo in the top left of this yearbook page to illustrate a young version of him, I think that would be a very unlikely fair use, because it's just a photo of him that you're using to illustrate a profile of him. On the other hand, if you're doing a story about the scandal that has erupted as a result of this whole yearbook page, and you use the whole yearbook page and your story is about what's on the yearbook page, then you're much further into fair use territory, and you think you're going to be in good shape. I mean, one thing that does come up a lot, I'll just mention, is yearbook photos. Somebody becomes unexpectedly famous. Everybody goes around looking for photos of them. They maybe find a high school or college yearbook, and they grab the photos out. And you can be subject to liability for using those, because the photographer who took them is probably a professional who may be likely to sue you. Going back to our favorite example with AOC, I said before that the Fox's use, I thought, would be unlikely to be a fair use when they're just using it to illustrate a general political story about her. However, if you are doing a story about the copyright lawsuit, and the story is about this photo, which prompted a copyright lawsuit, in that case, I think your fair use argument is very strong. And in this case, you see, I underlined here, they got this photo from Pacer, which you may know is the sort of online repository for papers filed in federal court. So they pulled the papers, in this case, got this photo out, and because the story is about the case and about the photo, they, I think, are justified in using it without getting permission. All right, so some tips to maximize the possibility that something you use and you can't get a license for will be a fair use. One, you want to add context, new information, commentary, or analysis specifically about the photo or video. So this comes up a lot, excuse me, in the social media context. You know, somebody will ask me, you know, so-and-so has been accused of fighting in school. And there's this whole, you know, big investigation about, you know, what happened during this school fight. Can I use these images from this person's social media page? And, you know, I think there's always something of a risk in that. But if you talk about the fact that, you know, some of these images have gone viral, or you sort of take thumbnails of a bunch of different images on the page, or you do something to transform the information that you're just pulling off of Facebook, and you're talking about those images specifically, then you're going to be in better shape. You know, use the smallest amount of the material that you can. As I said, add other things to transform the work, and crop or focus on specific elements, but be sure to retain the copyright information on the photo, because taking that out can lead to a whole separate line of liability. So don't do that. So speaking of social media, there's a couple of cautionary tales I want to mention and provide as examples in hopes that they will be illuminating to you. So this one, as I mentioned, is one that was a big deal in the media community because it was a little bit earlier in the internet's life, and there was some question about, you know, what could be done. And it's very clear here. You see the jury awarded the photographer in this case $303,000 in actual damages and $1.2 million in statutory damages. And I won't go into now the difference between all the different kinds of damages that you can get into a copyright case. But I will say that if you get notice from the copyright holder that you don't have permission to use that image, and you think that your fair use argument is not strong, you should consider strongly taking down the image, because leaving up an image after you have been notified that you don't have the rights to it, if you don't have a good fair use defense, can amplify the damages that you may ultimately have to pay, or can up the potential settlement value of the case. This one is a little bit more recent. So you see here this article on TMZ, President Trump wedding crasher, and it's a little story about how this couple was getting married at one of Trump's golf clubs. He happened upon them, and one of the guests at the wedding, you know, took this picture. So TMZ grabbed the picture, did this little article, tweeted it out. Then the guy who took the photo says, "Hey, TMZ, this is my photo. Where is my credit and compensation? Someone at the event with me obviously shared without permission. Please DM me." So he didn't post it, this guy, Jonathan Otto. One of his friends posted a photo that he had taken. TMZ grabbed it. he said, you know, where's my permission? Or excuse me, where's your permission? Sued and lost a fair use argument, even though he's not a professional photographer, because the story wasn't about the photo. The story was about the fact that Trump crashed the wedding. And so the court says, you know, stealing a copyrighted photograph to illustrate a news article without adding new understanding or meaning to the work does not transform its purpose, regardless of whether that photograph was created for commercial or personal use. So in this case, the guy who took the photo, Jonathan Otto, was not a professional photographer. He was just a guy. But he believed that this photo had value and that he could license it. And so he sued. I mean, the end of this story is that at the end of the day, he didn't win very much in damages. However, that only happened after several years worth of expensive litigation and a loss on the question of fair use. So it's just a cautionary tale to, you know, think twice before just posting images that you grab from social media. All right, I'm going to finish up by talking about embedding. Now, I think many of you should be familiar with this. It only is going to apply online. It's not going to apply to your print news stories or to broadcast news. But essentially, for years and years after the advent of social media, the rule was if you embed a photo, or if you embed a tweet or a Facebook post or a photo from a social media site, you cannot be on the hook for copyright infringement. And just to back up a little bit and mention for 2 seconds the technology, the idea is that when you are running an online story and you embed a photograph from a different site, you're not actually making a copy of it. You're just pulling the data from another site so that it is visible on your site, but you're not actually copying it. So for example, if you embed a photo from Facebook and then the Facebook user takes down that photo, it would automatically disappear from your site because you have not made a copy of it. And so for years and years, the courts held that's fine. That's not really a copy. And so there's not going to be copyright liability. But a couple of years ago, excuse me, I got ahead of myself. This photo of Tom Brady talking to somebody on the Celtics about recruiting Kevin Durant. I'm not really a sports person, so I'm not exactly sure of the significance of this, but this was a photo that a guy on the street caught of Tom Brady talking to some of these Celtics bigwigs. Again, he sent it to a friend of his. His friend posted it online on a social media site, and a bunch of news organizations embedded it in their online news stories. So the actual photographer sued a lot of these news organizations, you know, saying you didn't have permission to use this photo, and I never gave permission to the social media companies to let you embed it, etc. And the court was persuaded by this to say it's still infringing on somebody's copyright, even if you don't actually copy the photo, but you pull the image in from a different website. And so since he didn't post the photo himself, you know, you're potentially on the hook. So now the rule is, if you are certain that the person who posted the photo or video is the copyright holder, then you can embed without risk of liability, because if you as the copyright holder upload your photo to a social media site, the terms of use on that social media site will usually say you are giving permission to allow other sites to use the API here to embed photos on their website. That is a thing that you are giving up when you post on social media. Now, I don't want to say this is necessarily true for all social media sites, but certainly for the big ones, Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook, this is currently true. If you are the copyright holder and you post a photo on one of these sites and somebody embeds that photo, you are not going to have a good claim against them. However, if somebody who is not the copyright holder posts something on social media and you embed it, you may be potentially on the hook because that copyright holder never gave permission for any embedding the way that somebody who was the actual copyright owner does if they post it on social media. So that's a little bit tricky, and sometimes you have to be very careful when you're using when you're embedding photos, unless you know that it's coming from, you know, a specific organization or person. So that is a little bit complicated, but hopefully it made sense. So let me take some questions about fair use or anything else with respect to copyright.
This is Rebecca. I have a question from someone whose microphone is not working.
Okay.
Could you clarify if the publication is a nonprofit news entity, if that commercial use clause applies in the same way? Like, do they get a free pass because they're nonprofit?
You're talking about like on a like Creative Commons license?
Yes.
So in general, I think that news uses, whether they're profit or nonprofit, are not going to be considered commercial, generally speaking. And so you should be okay. I'm not sure that the distinction between profit and nonprofit is going to be meaningful there, but sometimes the Creative Commons licenses will allow specifically for nonprofit uses, even if they're not allowing for, you know, other types of uses, non-personal uses, in which case, then yes, it would benefit you to be a nonprofit and you could, you know, use it in those circumstances.
So basically, as long as you read the fine print on things like that and be aware.
Yeah, no, that's exactly right. And you know, some of these Creative Commons licenses can be very tricky, and not to be too much of a scaremonger, but you also occasionally have a problem on some of those sites where the copyright holder is not the one posting the photos. And in that case, even if you follow those licenses to the letter, you know, you're still potentially on the hook if the person who posted those photos wasn't authorized to post them. So, you know, you just need to be careful about the sources of your information, or the sources of your images. And you know, if you get one of these Creative Commons license and you feel like it's not clear to you whether a news use is allowed, send it to us and we're happy to take a look and talk it through with you.
Okay, terrific. What other questions do people have?
I have a question about book reviews and the on book cover images. Excuse me. Sometimes when we write book reviews, the art director will take an image from Amazon of the book cover. Sometimes they take it from the publisher's website. I just wanted to know what the issues are there.
I think generally speaking, taking the cover of a book to use in connection with a book review is okay. I mean, it might be safer to get that image from the publisher because they're usually going to make those images available because they're delighted if the book gets reviewed. And it seems unlikely to me that they're going to complain about that. And my experience is that most of the time the publisher is going to own the copyright in that, or at least is going to have the right to allow those kind of uses. So I wouldn't worry so much about book cover art, but I do think it would be safer to get the images from the publisher than from Amazon.
Okay, thanks.
I have a question sort of about like, I don't know, like typical news gathering situations where a reporter is, you know, dealing with maybe like a communications person or the source in a story, and they receive, and that person gives them a photo that a third person took. And I guess while obviously the ideal such thing is to always get like the permission directly from the photographer, are there any situations in which like getting permission from like the, for example, PR person is okay? Or
well, I mean, I guess it sort of depends on the circumstances. If you're doing a story and there's like a particular PR person that you're working with and that person gives you the image, in most cases, you should have an implied license to use that photo because you're getting it from somebody whose job is literally to give stuff to the press. And so you should have that. Now, you know, if you want to be extra safe, you might want to ask that press person, hey, just want to confirm that you have the right to be giving us this photo and letting us use it. But generally speaking, if you're getting stuff from a communications person or a press person, you should be okay. I mean, I think the harder question is, when you're talking to a source and a source gives you information about something, or photos, let's say, that someone else gave to them, that puts you in a trickier position. And in that case, I normally advise people to use some of those tips that I mentioned in one of the slides, which is to say, talk specifically about the photos as opposed to only using them to illustrate a different story. So, if there's a photo of somebody doing a particular thing, talk about what's going on in the photo and, do your best to incorporate it and, use a smaller amount and do all the sort of little, things that we talk about to try and get you into fair use territory if you can't get a license or can't determine the origin.
Would you ever, so let's say you have a story, you have a source for the story, and for an image for the story, you're just using like a photo of the source. Would you ever distinguish like between, for example, I don't know, like for example, if the photo was taken by like a friend of theirs versus like a professional photographer, would you maybe, go an extra step to really make sure you have the permission in the case of it being by a professional photographer, like versus just like a random, friend or family member or something like that?
I mean, yeah, so technically speaking, if I had the choice, if the photos were otherwise equal and I had the choice between you, and I'm not going to be able to get permission, I have the choice between a professional photographer and an amateur, I would take the amateur because that's going to way higher in the fair use analysis if it's not somebody who typically sells these for a living. Also, depending on your story, you can sort of think about it just practically. This doesn't go to any of the fair use factors, but if you're doing a story and the story is one where the source is cooperating with you and wants to do the story, and that person's friend took a picture of them, I mean, it seems like, just practically speaking, the likelihood of them filing a copyright suit against you is pretty low. And also the likelihood that you could just ask that friend, hey, is it okay if I use this photo, is also higher. So, and the professional photographer, I mean, the good thing about that is that, unlike sometimes with these social media images, part of the problem is you don't know who took the photo and you don't know what the origin is, so it's hard for you to ask for permission. With the professional photographer, they're happy to license you the photo. And so, unless you're under real news exigencies or the price that they're quoting you is insane, sometimes the easier route is just to go with them because they're already set up to license photos to you.
Okay. I think we have time for just one more question because I'm just noting it's almost 20 past 10. Anybody have one final question? Going once? Twice. Okay, well, thank you so much, Elia, for working with us on this, and I learned so much. Thank you very, very much. I want to give a little plug for our upcoming webinars in this series. We'll come back together on Wednesday, September 23rd, with Joy from Trusting News, Joy Mayer, who will be talking about creating election coverage that's trusted. We'll then be doing a deep dive into campaign finance reports, and that will be on Wednesday, September 30th and October 1st. We're going to look at Maryland, Delaware, DC, and hopefully federal, and all sorts of good things. We're also later on going to be making sense of polls on October 7th with Mylea Cromer of the Goucher poll, and then wrapping up our series with Susan Canfora interviewing sources about sensitive subjects, which certainly is politics these days. So I hope that you all will join us for those items. I will be pushing out this recording of our webinar in this week's Friday Planner. And again, if you have any questions or need our legal hotline, Aaliyah and the other team members at Ballard Spahr are always willing to help. You can access them just by emailing me at rsnyder@MDDC Press. That is a member benefit, so your organization does need to be a member of MDDC to access it. So with that, thank you all so much for spending time with us, and we will see you again soon.
Thank you.
Thanks.